Do the New York Giants really need another receiver? What are some of the team's sneaky needs and answers to your questions? All of that and more coming up on today's Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. My name is Patricia Traina. Happy Thursday to everybody. We're almost at the end of the week. Week's just going by fast. And on today's episode of the Locked On Giants podcast, we're going to explore the question, do the Giants need another receiver? And I bring that question up because a lot of you have said, the Giants, the last thing they need is another receiver. Well, I've got some thoughts about that. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about sneaky needs for this team, basically needs that, people really aren't talking about that probably should. And then I'm going to answer some questions that you guys and gals sent to me. So that is the agenda on today's episode, which is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. And speaking of getting started, let's get started here on the Locked On Giants podcast. We're going to start things off with answering the question, do the Giants need another wide receiver? Now, last I checked, the Giants had 13 guys under contract who play receiver. And this doesn't include, obviously, the tight ends, Darren Waller, Daniel Bellinger, etc., who, for the sake of this discussion, we will keep those guys separate. All right, so people look at what the Giants did in free agency and they say, oh my gosh, they signed, Jamison Crowder, Jeff Smith, Paris Campbell. They brought back Darius Slayton. They brought back Isaiah Hodgins. They brought back Sterling Shepard. What do they need for more receivers? That's the question I get. Well, folks, I'm here to tell you that I would not be surprised if the Giants add another receiver. I would actually hope they would add another receiver. And here's why. The Giants, if you look at how they have signed their receivers, the contracts that everybody has, Shepard, 1-year deal, Hodgins, 1-year deal, Campbell, 1-year deal, Crowder and Smith, 1-year deals. All right. I think Colin Johnson is under contract already, but I think this is his last year. So, Shepard, I don't remember if I mentioned Shepard, but he's on a 1-year deal. First off, folks, not all of those guys are going to make the roster. I think that's pretty much something that we could all safely say. There's going to be some competition. Now, a lot of you are like, okay, so the Giants got to get a big X receiver type, right? Yeah, that would be nice, but not necessary. I mean, yes, it would be great if, Daniel Jones had a skyscraper to throw to, other than Waller, who, again, for all intents and purposes, is still technically a tight end. But if you go back to what Joe Schoen and Brian Dable said earlier this year, they're not so much worried about size as they are about, can the guys get open? That's where the concern or the focus is. So, yeah, it would be great to have, a few taller targets in the mix, but it's not really, necessary, at least not this year. So getting back to the number of receivers on this team's roster, we talk about consistency when it comes to Daniel Jones. So the Giants, obviously, they just committed to Daniel Jones for at least 2 years, up to 4 years with this new deal that he signed. They brought back, or Mike Kafka, I should say, is back. So it's going to be the same play caller in his ear. The same assistant coach, Shea Tierney is back, is in Daniel's ear. Brian Dable is in his ear. So if you're the Giants, ideally you want to make sure that you put as much continuity around Daniel Jones as possible. All right. So you've got the system. This year coming up will be the second time or the second year in a row Daniel Jones is in the same system, something that he hasn't really been in throughout his whole career. All right. He's going to have the same playing caller. He's going to have the same head coach, same quarterbacks coach. Ideally, now, if you're the Giants, you want to do two things. You, A, want to give him the same offensive line so that they can, kind of mesh together. And that's, a topic for another show. But you also want to make sure you give him the same receivers so that he could build up that chemistry and just get better and better. Daniel Jones, you look at the receivers he's had, guys have come and gone. And while he has done a decent job of building chemistry with those guys, the more you can build up that chemistry, the more you can be consistent, the better. So, you look back over the years, he had Darius Slayton, who came into the league with Daniel Jones in 2019. Two of them know each other like the back of their hands. Sterling Shepard's another guy who's been there since 2019 now. Whether or not Sterling is going to be back this year, he's still rehabbing, obviously, from that torn ACL. That remains to be seen, but he's another guy who could be consistent for Daniel. Isaiah Hodgins, year 2 now, or technically first full year coming up. He could be a consistent force for Daniel. Now you throw in these other receivers, the Paris Campbells, the Jamison Crowders, the Jeff Smiths. Well, Jeff Smith is probably more special teams, but you throw in these other guys, Wan'Dale Robinson, when he's healthy, you have a chance now to build continuity. And that's only going to help Daniel Jones get better. We've seen in the past, Eli Manning, when he had Plaxico Burress, the two of them were on the same page and they made some nice plays together. Same thing back in the day with Steve Smith, Amani Toomer when he played, Kevin Boss, the tight end, when he played. There's something to be said for continuity between a quarterback and his receiving targets. So I think if you combine the fact that the Giants have a lot of guys on one-year contracts, so they're kind of, I want to say this is almost like an audition, a one-year audition for them. Those that perform, I suspect the Giants will look to re-sign after this season. You also take into consideration that Shepard's coming back from an injury, that Wan'Dale Robinson is coming back from an injury, that Colin Johnson is coming back from an injury. And it just makes sense to just build up the number of receivers that they have, add another guy, ideally, if you could get a tall skyscraper, great. If you can't, get somebody who can separate. I think that's probably going to take more precedence over anything else if you're the Giants and you're looking to draft a receiver. Now, should they go first round for a receiver? That depends on who's on the board. If a Zay Flowers is on the board, sure. If Jordan Addison is on the board, absolutely. So you don't want to reach, obviously, for a receiver in the first round at 25. And I know some of you, in response to my mock draft yesterday, said, just trade down, trade out of the first round, and just pick up extra picks on day 2 and day 3. Guys, you lose the 5th-year option if you do that. And you really, you're not talking that much of a savings salary cap wise if you do that. You might even add a little to your salary cap at the end of the day. So the more I think about it, the more I would say, if the Giants are going to trade in the first round, I wouldn't trade out of it. I might trade down, if there's a team that wants to come up a few spots, but I wouldn't trade out of it. And yes, I know cornerback is a need. I know center is a need. I know linebacker is a need. But I still say, folks, that wide receiver is a need. I won't call it a sneaky need, but I think given the complexion of the wide receiver group that the Giants have, it's definitely a need that they're going to want to address moving forward. If for no other reason, again, give Daniel Jones what he needs. You want to put him into, if you're committed to putting him into a position to succeed, start giving him continuity. Receivers, offensive line, that should be the objective for General Manager Joe Schoen to get done by the time this draft is done. Will they get all of it done? You can't address all the needs, obviously, in an off season, but those are the main needs that if I'm the Giants, I'm looking to get addressed in the draft coming up. All right. Speaking of coming up next, we're going to talk about sneaky needs on this team that really not a lot of people are talking about, but probably should be. Stick around. Hey, Giant fans, the tournament is heating up, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's because right now, FanDuel is giving new customers a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon and sign up today to claim your no-sweat first bet. Then you can wager on everything from the money line to point spreads to which team will be cutting down the net. Make every moment more with FanDuel. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, and we are coming to you on March 30th. Only a couple days left to the month, and then we're rolling right into April. The draft, off-season conditioning program starts. Spring football is back. So a lot of stuff coming up in the month of April. But until we get there, couple things coming up here on the Locked On Giants podcast I want to talk to you about. I'm going to have on tomorrow's show, Damian Parson is making a return visit. He is from the Locked On NFL Draft Show. Had him on a few weeks ago, I think before the combine or during the combine, I think it was. And a lot of you liked his overview of draft prospects. So we're going to hear from Damian regarding rumors, what he's heard, who's going where. We're going to get his insight on who improved their stock, who didn't, and so on and so forth. So that show's coming up on Friday. And then next week, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to have on the show, or I'm scheduled to have on the show, I should say. I'm going to have Willie Anderson on the show. Now, who is Willie Anderson? Willie Anderson is a former NFL offensive lineman who's been training Evan Neal. So I reached out and asked if he would come on the program, and he's going to come on the program. And we're going to just kind of pick his brain a little bit about, the challenges that Evan Neal or basically offensive tackles, young offensive tackles face, and how they can overcome that. So I'm really excited to talk to Willie about that. That's going to be next week. That should be Monday's show. So if everything stays on schedule, that's what I have planned for Monday. And then speaking of next week, I still have a couple more guests that I'm waiting to hear back on as to when they're going to be able to tape with me. But we're going to be doing draft because 'tis the time. It's the most wonderful time of the off-season NFL calendar. It's the draft. So that's what we're going to do. So plenty of stuff coming up on the Locked On Giants podcast. Hope you will tune in. And I hope you continue to enjoy the program. So, all right, let's get into the next segment here. Sneaky needs for the New York Giants. Now, for me, sneaky need is defined as something that is a glaring need, but we're not really talking a whole lot about because it's not really important in the grand scheme of it. Well, actually, let me take that back. It is important in the grand scheme of things, but if you're prioritizing the needs on a team, these are probably towards the middle to end of your list. So to give you an example of a sneaky need that was filled, blocking tight end was a sneaky need. And the Giants went out and they signed Tommy Sweeney from the Bills, who is known as a blocking tight end. And that was a sneaky need because if you go back and you look at the run blocking by the tight ends last year, wasn't very consistent and it wasn't always good. So the Giants went out and they addressed that need, sneaky need. You figure, okay, they traded for Darren Waller. They got Daniel Bellinger. They should be set at tight end. No, they needed a blocker. And, Sweeney's going to compete to be that blocker. What else is a sneaky need? I have 3 things I've identified. The first one, and to me, the biggest one, pass rusher. So the Giants do have Kayvon Thibodeau. They have Azeez Ojulari, who the latter of whom is coming off injuries. And who, oh, by the way, Ojulari, for what it's worth, when he was out there, kind of a little inconsistent against the run. So if you're going to have an edge rusher out there, you want somebody who could also handle the run if need be. And Ojulari at times had his share of adventures with that. How much of that was related to his lower body injuries, I can't say. I don't know. But you saw it kind of, pop up a few times. The Giants also officially re-signed Jihad Ward. Hadi is back. And he, of course, could be a pass rusher. They have Ellerson Smith. But what they have in him, I don't know. I mean, you go back and you look at Ellerson Smith's path from college to the NFL. I think the last time he played a full season, was in 2019. I think 2020, his college campaign was canceled due to the pandemic. And then, of course, 2021, he came out, was injured, spent, I think a good chunk of the time on injured reserve. Last year, injured again on injured reserve. What do they have in this guy? At what point do you say, okay, you know what? Maybe it's time we go in a different direction. I don't know. I think we're going to find out this spring what they have in them. So anyway, the Giants right now, you could say, have 4 guys at edge rusher, and you could throw in Tamon Fox, obviously, he came on, but you can never have too many pass rushers. And as we saw last year with the injuries, you need to have, a nice deep rotation there. So I would not be stunned if the Giants look to add in the draft, maybe even on day 3, get a developmental pass rusher if you need to. Just somebody to kind of play up, because you're probably not going to have Jihad Ward forever. And like I said, with Ellerson Smith, who knows what you've got with him, and who knows if he's going to be able to stay healthy. So if I'm the Giants, I look to maybe address pass rusher. Now, I know some of you are saying, well, for the pass rush, it's the back end of the defense. You got to, really beef up. Yes, you're right. But you also need guys that can get home in the front end. And while the Giants do have also as part of that pass rush, Leonard Williams and Dexter Lawrence, again, you want guys coming off the edge as well, because the more you can send, the better. So to me, pass rusher is a sneaky need. What else is a sneaky need? Let's say offensive tackle. The Giants have obviously Andrew Thomas and Evan Neal. Although there's been some debate amongst the fan base, people have written to me and said, wouldn't Evan Neal be better off inside at guard? Right now, I don't think that's the plan, folks. I think the plan right now is for him to play a tackle. So anyway, behind those guys, you've got Tyree Phillips. You've got Jack Anderson, who I believe can play some tackle. You've got Matt Peart. I would like to see them add another offensive tackle. I'm not feeling warm and fuzzy about that depth, to be honest with you. Phillips was okay last year when pressed into action. Peart, came back off the injury. He was, serviceable. I don't know. To me, I want maybe a little bit more than what I saw from those guys last year, that depth, because, you lose one of those guys, you lose Andrew Thomas, God forbid, knock on wood that they don't. And that's a big drop off right now. And that's where my concern is, why I think this is a sneaky need, because if one of those 2 starters gets injured, you're talking a drop off, and a noticeable drop off. So to me, I just think it makes sense to add another offensive tackle. And I'm not saying get him in the first round or on day 2, but maybe somewhere along the line, obviously I would address center first before I get an offensive tackle. Somewhere along the line, maybe pick up a guy who could play a guard tackle spot, be your swing guy for the future. That's how I would go. So that if down the line, for some reason, the Giants coaches decide, you know what, we're moving on from Mark Lewinsky, maybe we'll try Evan Neal inside at guard. And again, that would be down the line. Right now, that is not the plan as I understand it. So now you've got depth. And one of the mistakes the Giants have always made in the past is when it came to the offensive line, they didn't have depth ready to step in when they needed it. That's got to change, folks. You got to have guys at the ready in case something happens. And they just haven't done a good job at that. So that needs to change. And I would not object if they add a offensive tackle. One more sneaky need, and this one's kind of generic, but I've got to mention it. They need guys who could play special teams, whether that's linebackers, safeties, running backs, receivers, whatever. They need special teams players. Last year, I don't have to tell you that the coverage teams were inconsistent and they weren't very good. So that being said, part of the reason was, I think guys that special teams coordinator Thomas McGahee was counting on having were pulled off special teams and bumped up to offense or defense. The guys that came in to play to replace them, I question how much experience they had on special teams in college. My guess is not enough. So you look at gunner, for example, Jeff Smith, one of the unrestricted free agents they signed, he could play a little gunner. Cam Brown, who's been on the roster, he can play gunner. But you need to mix it up. You need to have options. And, we saw it last year, folks. The special teams, the coverage teams were just not what they needed to be. Now, some of you will say, well, what about the coaching? How much did that play into it? You got to look at the whole picture. I'm not going to say that the coaching is exempt from the problem because, obviously everybody has to do better. And, if you're pulling guys onto special teams now that maybe didn't have as much experience and you got to get them coached up, yeah, that would fall on the coaching. But, I think just getting guys who have that versatility so that if you have to pull a guy off of special teams, if, for example, you've got to pull Jeff Smith off special teams one week because you need him on offense, you've got somebody who can replace him. I don't think the Giants had that last year where, they had guys that could replace others when they had to come off special teams. So that to me was an issue. And hence is why I consider that to be a sneaky need. All right, Giant fans, coming up next, your questions here on the Locked On Giants podcast. Don't go anywhere. Hey, Giant fans, thanks so much for making the Locked On Giants podcast your first listen or watch every day. Now make your second listen Locked On NFL Draft. Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez provide in-depth coverage of the biggest NFL draft prospects with deep dives into the sleepers and hidden gems that can change your favorite franchise. Find Locked On NFL Draft wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. And again, thank you so much, folks, for another record-setting month here at the Locked On Giants podcast. I mean, I'm just absolutely humbled by the number of views over on YouTube, by the number of listens we've been getting here on the podcast. Listen, I really enjoy doing these podcasts. I enjoy, interacting with you guys and gals. I love doing the live shows with Tana and Bad Dog. And you really make it really worth the while for me. So Thank you so much for checking out my work. It is so deeply appreciated. And by the way, if you haven't checked out my work over on Giants Country, where also we have the likes of Nick Filato, who does our draft previews, or draft prospect profiles, and we have a bunch of other, writers, Gene Clemens. We have Quinn Slavin, who's new, Tim Lindsay, who's new, Stephen Labitz, who's still, was with us last year, Olivier Dumont. Check us all out. And I know Brandon Olson. I can't forget Brandon. Oh gosh, Brandon, if you're listening, I'm sorry. I almost forgot you. So check us out over on Giants Country if you haven't already done so, because we're putting new content up every single day. All right. Now, time to get to some questions that were submitted via Twitter as well as via email. So let's do it. I'm going to start off with a question submitted via email. I'm sorry, via Twitter. Let me get those Twitter questions done first. Brett Moore asks, if the Giants don't draft a receiver early, what are your thoughts on Tucker and Scott out of Cincy? Both undersized but explosive, seem like potential mid-round flyers, given what Shane and Dave will like. You know what, Brett? I do think the Giants may draft a receiver early, but to your point about the mid-round guys, I'll confess I don't know a whole lot about Tucker and Scott out of Cincy. I don't recall doing work on them yet or seeing anything from Nick on them yet. But, could I see the Giants double dipping in this pool? Probably. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they add somebody also as an undrafted free agent. But, for me, I think that where they need to really double dip is at cornerback. That's where I would try and double dip, because you could set yourself up for the future. So I do think the Giants are going to maybe prioritize receiver a little higher, if I'm being totally honest with you. So, all right, Brian Wilkie. Is there any belief that we have a dark horse wide receiver one already on the roster? Oh, good question, Brian. You know what? Here's the thing. I would say probably Waller would be considered that number one receiver, even though he's a tight end. But here's the thing. When you talk about a number one receiver, you tend to think of a guy who's going to get the ball a lot. And I think that the Giants offense is set up so that no one guy is going to be featured every single week. So I don't want to say that the term number one receiver is a misnomer, but it kind of is, because one week you might have, Darius Slayton might be the guy that gets all the targets. The next week it might be Hodgins. The next week it might be Waller. But to your point, do they have a legitimate X receiver? I think that's maybe what you were looking to get across there. That I do think they have. I think Hodgins can be that guy. I don't know if Slayton can be that guy. I don't see why not. I mean, Slayton, yes, but I would say at this point, maybe Hodgins is more of that X receiver. But let's see how it plays out, because last year was kind of a getting to know you stage, feeling out stage, if you will. And I just want to see how it plays out. I think maybe somebody will step up and we'll see what ends up happening there. But it's certainly a possibility that there's a number one receiver just lying in the weights. Colin Johnson, he was a guy that I know a lot of people were intrigued with until he went and got hurt, early in training camp last year. So I would say right now, Brian, there's probably a wait and see scenario. So I'm not going to sit here and say, no, they don't have anybody who might be, a legitimate X receiver, but let's wait and see. I'll have a better feel for that. Maybe as we get through the spring, I'll be able to report back on that and give you what I'm seeing. So, all right, next question. This one came via email from Gabe. And he asks, do you think Saquon's agent messed up because of the fact that reportedly the Giants went as high as $13.5 million and they still didn't accept it? Here's the thing. I don't blame Saquon for wanting to get as much money as he possibly could. And I think at the time, I could be wrong here, but at the time, they were through, it was the bye week when this offer was made. And Saquon, if I'm not mistaken, was running hot at the time. And he probably figured, okay, look, I'm going to continue to run hot and I'm going to be worth more than the 12.5 million that you guys are offering me per year. And then we all know what happened. The run game kind of cooled off a little bit. So that being said, I don't think Saquon messed up. I don't think his agent messed up for turning down the Giants offer. Because again, their job, the agent's job, is to get the client as much money as possible. Now, where I think maybe there was a little bit of a disconnect was in judging the market for the free agency market. All right. So you knew Zeke Elliott was going to get cut. And when you started to see guys like Miles Sanders get like what, $6 million a year, that kind of pushed in the direction that maybe the market just wasn't going to develop. And it didn't develop. And here's the other thing. You have a very deep class of running backs, which further weakens the market. So basically, if we go to the old supply and demand concept, the supply is way bigger right now than the demand. So in that regard, yeah, you could say maybe they misjudged. But then again, looking at it from their perspective, you could say, well, who in the draft is better than Saquon right now? Maybe Robinson from was it Texas? Maybe. But who else can you honestly say that about? Maybe Gibbs. So yeah, I mean, I feel for Saquon because, it looks like he's going to have to play on the tag. And it looks like, he's going to be leaving some money on the table this year. But here's the other thing that I'll say, Gabe. We don't know, I mean, it was quoted, it was like 12.5, 13 million per year. But we don't know if that was a true 12.5, 13, or was that with incentives. So we're not really sure exactly how that contract was structured. So I'm not going to sit here and blame the agent for screwing this up. I think, Kim Miali, she's a very good agent. And I think she did her due diligence. I can see their side, their perspective. But you know what? Listen, the more the Giants make moves, the less money there is. And, the Giants have their price in mind for Saquon. I know they would love to have him back. John Mara has said it. I think Joe Schoen has said it. I'm sure Brian Dable has said it. But they're not going to break the bank open for Saquon, nor should they. Because running backs right now, like I said, the supply is bigger than the demand. And I would not be shocked if Saquon plays on this year on the tag. I would not be shocked if he doesn't show up for the start of the offseason program or the OTAs. And I would not be shocked if he doesn't sign that tag until July 17th, which is the deadline for both sides to get a long-term deal done. So that's when I think maybe we see him sign that deal. Could that go beyond, to the point where he holds out a training camp? It's a possibility. I hope it doesn't come to that because look, everybody needs to train. And, Saquon is no different. And I'm not talking about, the individual training that they do on their own. I'm talking about getting in there with their teammates and, playing the team sport. So, yeah, I hope it doesn't get to the point where Saquon just says, you know what, I'm not showing up until the first week of the season. I think that would be a mistake, but, him skipping the voluntary offseason program, I wouldn't like it, but I wouldn't blame him if he did so. So that's how I see that one. So thank you for that question, Gabe. Appreciate it. All right. I think that is the last of the questions. Let me just quick check and make sure that I don't have any other questions. Okay. Nope, that's it. That's all the questions I have. So anyway, those of you who might want to send me a question, I'm going to work them into the pods wherever I have openings. So please send them to me. You can tweet them to me at Patricia_Traina. You can send them to me on Instagram at Patty Traina, PATTITRAINA. You can email them to me at lockedongiantspodcast@gmail.com. And I'll work them into the show wherever I can. So that is going to do it for us on today's Locked On Giants podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate you as always. And don't forget to check us out tomorrow. Again, our special guest, Damian Parson of Locked On NFL Draft. So we will see you tomorrow, Giant fans.